At 2 in the morning, long lines of cars are still inching forward, meter by meter, outside gas stations in Nanjing and Beijing. Inside those cars, drivers are glued to the news, reading about the inferno in the Middle East, then nervously looking up at electronic price boards as the numbers keep changing. They are staying awake all night, fighting for every last liter of fuel before the next price hike hits. It is an astonishing contradiction. When a superpower can build aircraft carriers and hypersonic missiles with ease, why are its people terrified over a few cents at the pump? To understand this wave of panic on the ground, we have to look thousands of miles away toward one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth. The panic at the pump did not appear out of nowhere. It exploded the moment reports of a brutal escalation in the Middle East began spreading, followed by a sudden fuel price increase announced by China's National Development and Reform Commission. Ordinary people understood the message hidden beneath that announcement immediately. The energy supply was genuinely under threat. But why should an American, living half a world away, care how much a driver in Beijing has to pay to fill a gas tank? Because if a spark in the Middle East is enough to rattle the domestic fuel system of the so-called factory of the world, then the global supply chain American consumers depend on is far more fragile than it looks. The products sitting on supermarket shelves across the US are powered by the very oil now under threat. The real issue is not a few liters of gasoline in the middle of the night. The real issue is the massive supply structure behind it. For China's enormous manufacturing machine to keep running without interruption, it needs an enormous amount of blood, oil. And this is exactly where the fatal weakness lies. Right now, more than half of the country's total oil imports come from the Middle East. Of that total, a staggering flow of roughly 1.38 million barrels of oil per day is quietly moving from Iran into Chinese ports, accounting for roughly 11 to 12% of the nation's total oil imports. You might ask, why would an economy that constantly talks about security and self-reliance tie its fate to a regime under layers of sanctions and international pressure? The answer comes down to the most basic economic calculation of any industrial system. At a time when the domestic economy is under heavy strain, access to deeply discounted crude oil, priced far below the global market, is more than just a bargain. It is a lifeline. China's independent refineries continue taking in that energy flow day and night. It saves billions of dollars, keeps freight costs low, and preserves the core competitive advantage behind millions of export products shipped all over the world. But every cheap, short-term solution comes with an extremely expensive geopolitical bill in the long run. That energy does not move by magic. Nearly half of Beijing's total oil imports must pass through one of the narrowest and most dangerous choke points on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz. In the global logistics system, a strait like Hormuz functions exactly like a heart valve. Any blockade, armed confrontation, or military retaliation in that waterway means the valve can slam shut. And when the flow of 1.38 million barrels a day is suddenly disrupted, the shock will not unfold gradually. It will hit the entire domestic logistics chain almost instantly. What drivers feel at the gas station in the dead of night is only the first ripple on the surface before the real storm arrives. The structure of this economy creates a brutal cycle. To grow at the lowest possible cost, China is forced to import risk from some of the most unstable places on Earth. It is gambling that sea lanes will always stay open, but war is tearing that illusion apart. Risk is no longer buried in distant diplomatic reports sitting in government drawers. It is being priced directly into every liter of fuel. Beijing knows this weakness all too well, and it has been quietly pursuing a radical solution. For decades, Chinese strategists have been haunted by a geopolitical nightmare known as the Malacca Dilemma. The term refers to one deadly vulnerability. Most of the oil needed to sustain China's industrial machine must pass through the Strait of Malacca, where the US Navy could potentially choke it off in the event of a full-scale conflict. Cornered by the fear of being cut off from its lifeline, Beijing launched a strategic counterattack, one the outside world often naively mistakes for a purely environmental effort. The explosive rise of the country's electric vehicle industry, or EV industry, is not just an economic project or a carbon reduction strategy. In reality, it is a survival weapon, a desperate but calculated effort to break free from dependence on imported fossil fuels. Every electric vehicle on the streets of Shanghai means one less barrel of oil that has to be bought from the volatile Gulf. This energy transition is, in many ways, a national security strategy perfectly disguised as climate policy. When people in the West see images of Chinese drivers scrambling for gasoline in the middle of the night, many jump to an easy conclusion that this giant economy is on the verge of collapse because of energy shortages. But that is a dangerous mistake. Even with massive exposure to risks, stretching from Hormuz to Malacca, the Chinese state has quietly built an enormous defensive shield. We are talking about strategic petroleum reserves estimated at 1.39 billion barrels. Even in the worst-case scenario, with the Strait of Hormuz fully shut down by war, that stockpile would be enough to keep the national system and the military running for 120 days. 4 full months is enough time for a superpower to find alternate routes or intervene militarily to protect its survival. At the macro level, the system is not nearly as fragile as it appears. And yet the extraordinary resilience of the state stands in sharp contrast to the insecurity felt by ordinary people. That massive reserve is a life raft for the regime, not a sedative for the public. Those 120 days are like an hourglass hanging overhead. And once the first grains begin to fall, anxiety starts eating away at society from within. 1.39 billion hidden barrels cannot stop the electronic price boards at local gas stations from jumping higher every day. It cannot ease the rising cost of living, crushing delivery drivers and working families. The government may be secure, but ordinary people are pushed to the front line, left to absorb the shockwaves of geopolitical games they have no power to influence. And when internal anxiety grows too large to contain, a powerful system is forced to find ways to release pressure outward. That psychological pressure does not always show up through military action at sea. More often, it creeps into the way the state media machine overreacts to international events that seem, at first glance, completely unrelated. A striking example happened recently on the other side of Asia. When Arfia Eri, a Japanese politician of Uyghur heritage, made history by winning election to a foreign parliament, Beijing did not respond with the indifference of a confident great power. Instead, state media voices, including outlets like the Global Times, quickly launched into rhetoric laced with racial hostility, smearing her with terms like frontier poison. At a glance, many people might see this as a display of imperial confidence. But placed against the backdrop of long lines at gas stations in the middle of the night, it means something very different. It is not a sign of unmatched strength. It is evidence of extreme sensitivity, a defensive reflex from a system under too much pressure. When economic growth slows and the specter of an energy crisis hangs overhead, the system needs outside enemies. It needs nationalist flames to distract the public from the anxiety spreading underneath, redirecting anger away from the gas pump and toward distant targets beyond the border. Looking ahead at this geopolitical energy chessboard, we can sketch out the scenarios most likely to shape global stability. In the base case, which remains the most likely, Beijing will continue its balancing act. It will keep buying discounted oil from sanctioned states to keep manufacturing costs down, while forcing the domestic EV rollout forward at a breathtaking pace. In that scenario, the system keeps functioning smoothly on the surface, but ordinary people inside China will continue tightening their belts and quietly absorbing small psychological shocks each time another bad headline shatters the calm. But there is also a risk scenario that could become very real if events spiral out of control. If the conflict in the Middle East crosses invisible red lines and the Strait of Hormuz is fully blocked by military firepower, the 120-day countdown on China's strategic reserves begins immediately. At that point, panic at a handful of gas stations will no longer just be viral clips on social media. It will spread like a virus, turning into a full-blown crisis of confidence, crippling domestic logistics chains and paralyzing the factories that make goods for the entire world. The fragile line between those two outcomes will not be determined by Beijing alone. It depends on variables that are extremely difficult to predict. The first is the level of military restraint shown by the parties fighting in the Middle East, especially Iran and Israel. The second, and perhaps the more decisive variable for China's long-term autonomy, is the speed at which it can replace internal combustion vehicles with electric vehicles in smaller, more remote cities where the hunger for gasoline remains intense. The collision between ruthless strategic calculation and deeply human fear forces us to rethink how the world interprets and responds to China. The clash between national ambition and personal insecurity exposes one of the West's deepest misunderstandings. Just look at the EV industry. At the global level, there is a massive mismatch in motivation. When Western consumers buy electric vehicles, the main reasons are environmental protection, cutting carbon emissions, or saving polar bears. But for China, pouring billions of dollars into EV subsidies is not some idealistic green campaign. It is a hard-nosed national defense strategy designed to reduce dependence on crude oil flowing through dangerous straits. Lawmakers in Washington often see the surge of Chinese EVs as a battle for market share and a direct threat to jobs in Detroit. But they are fundamentally misreading the core motivation of the other side. Beijing does not just want to sell cars. It is building a survival machine designed to neutralize the threat of a future U.S. naval blockade. That is why even the harshest tariffs from Washington will never make China back down. Tariffs can slow a commercial corporation, but they cannot stop a country that sees this technology as vital to regime survival. So in the end, who is that massive survival fortress really protecting? The state has prepared enormous reserves to endure, but its people are running out of any sense of security. As long as oil must still pass through unstable Gulf waters, the image of long nighttime lines at the gas station will continue to haunt the country. What does macro-level national security really mean if it is built on the micro-level insecurity of more than 1 billion people? And in the West, are we competing with a rival that wants to dominate the world, or one that is doing everything it can just to avoid being strangled?